I'm Tanya Anderson from Lovely Greens, and I like to grow all the things. I have an extensive vegetable garden, an allotment garden as well, and I like to grow plants that we can eat, that I can use in handmade skincare, in handmade soap, and a lot of that has to do with ways that I can preserve that food or that herbal element so that I can use it or eat it later. And over the years, I've had quite a few people ask me questions as to what do we do with our gluts, especially in the vegetable garden. So all of those extra veggies and fruit and berries that we can't eat before it starts to go off. Do we give it away? Do we preserve it? And the answer is that we do preserve most of it when we do have gluts. And so I'd like to take you through 7 ways that I preserve food, simple ways that do not require a pressure canner. And I've got lots of examples here today. And if I mention any recipe in particular, you'll be able to find that recipe as a link down in the video description. One of my absolute favorite ways to preserve especially herbs, but also different plants for tea, is to dry it. And I've got some examples here. This is chamomile. This is from this year. I've got another container about half the size that is full as well. This is German chamomile. I air dried it and I've stored it in here once it was bone dry. Over here, this is rose bay willow herb, which is a type of a weed. And I was inspired by Permaculture magazine last year to ferment it first and then dry it out. And it makes a delicious tea. It's on par with black tea. I've also got some rose hips here and somewhere, there we go. We've got some chilies. These are from last year as well. I also dry mushrooms. And last year I took you on a little foraging excursion to go look for porcini mushrooms. And we found a few, quite older ones, but it doesn't matter because once you dry it out, it just is great to use as flavoring for all different types of dishes, risotto, the other types of pasta and rice dishes. So, so good. Now, I live in Britain. I live in the Isle of Man, and we have quite a damp climate here. Not so much right now, but definitely in spring and then later on into summer and early autumn. And so that means that it can be difficult to air dry a lot of vegetables and fruit and herbs. So what I do also have is a dehydrator, a food dehydrator, and I use it all the time. It's one of the main ways that I use to dehydrate calendula flowers, which I use in salves and soap. Also edible, but we don't eat it as much. I mainly use it for skincare and soap. And it is great for making things like fruit leathers, for dehydrating mushrooms. Again, it just does it so quickly. And so there's those 2 methods. There's air drying, either on screens or in bundles, or using the food dehydrator. Like drying foods, fermenting is also really safe. Fermenting vegetables and fruit and other types of produce from the garden. And what it involves is submerging that vegetable in a brine. And you can make that brine, typically 2% brine, so 2% salt, or you can add that salt directly to the vegetable if it has a lot of moisture in it, like cabbage does. And types of fermented food include things like sauerkraut and kimchi. And then there are other types of ferments as well that are not vegetable based. So things like yogurt and kefir. But with fermented vegetables, this is a great way to preserve your gluts, especially if you want to boost your immunity, you want to have something that's really healthy, and also it's delicious. Absolutely love fermented foods. Now, this is something that I've only really been getting into over the past year. And I think last May, I met my friend Pippa, who's got a restaurant here on the Isle of Man called Versa. She ferments a lot of food. And we did a video together about foraging for wild foods. So you can check out that video if you want to go and learn a little bit more about Pippa. Now, I've been experimenting with other types of fermented foods since then, including fermented radishes, which we love, absolutely love. And I've even made different types of ferments with broad beans, with onions, and wild garlic. Just you name it, it can be fermented. And the way that it works is that you submerge that vegetable in its brine, and then you let beneficial bacteria or yeast sometimes work their magic under the surface of the water. It has to be oxygen free, which is why you often see people use a fermenting tap like this, although it's not necessary. You just want to be able to keep the bugs out while it's fermenting, so you can put a cheesecloth over just a simple bowl or bucket as well. And once you have it made, you can put the ferment in a jar and then store it in the fridge for 6 months or potentially even longer. I'm not sure, because it never lasts that long here. I don't have any examples of frozen food here on the counter for obvious reasons. So let's go have a rummage through my freezer and I'll show you some of the things that I've been freezing this year. In a normal year, we have our chest freezer filled with frozen food, and we will get there after this season is over. But here are some of the things that I've been freezing. We've got some frozen raspberries, which are really easy. You just put the raspberries on some baking paper on a tray, freeze them, and then put them into a bag. That way they don't clump together. These are some of the broad beans from this year. I grew them for the first time this year, and I've taken our excess and I parboiled them, popped the delicious inner part out, and then froze them. And these are a little bit meticulous, well, very meticulous and time consuming, but so worth it. Those are just delicious. If you infuse fresh herbs into oil, and this is basil with olive oil, you absolutely have to freeze the oil afterwards. And that's because the fresh herb, even if it's dry, like rosemary, it can still have botulism on it. And if you leave that oil at room temperature, then it can make you sick. There's a possibility. So what you can do is freeze the olive oil. And that's what this is. This is frozen olive oil with basil. And I have a tutorial on how to do this in my book, A Woman's Garden, Grow Beautiful Plants and Make Useful Things. And then if you want to use one of these after freezing them and then popping them into a Tupperware, you just take one out and you can let it come to room temperature, or you can put it straight into a pan. And then also another positive side to this is that olive oil can go off. It can and will go off and go rancid at room temperature, and freezing it prolongs its life. Now this is a way to preserve basil, safely preserve basil. And all I've done here is I've put it in the food processor with a bit of olive oil. The olive oil you can see as the yellow bits. Frozen it again and then put it into a Ziploc bag. And so when I want to use this in the future, I can take out a cube or two and then use it to make pesto, or to put it in a sauce, or to use it however I would like. Lastly, we have sugar snap peas. And these are from this year. And all I've done is I've picked the sugar snaps, I've parboiled them, and parboiling helps stop the enzymes from degrading the color and the flavor and the texture. And then frozen them on a tray again, and then put them into a Ziploc bag afterwards. This way they stay free and not clump together in one massive clump of beans, and we can take them out and use them as we'd like. It's been a good few years since I made dill pickles, and I grew the gherkins this year specifically for dill pickles. And I made this batch just a couple days ago. And the dill inside is homegrown, the garlic is homegrown, and the recipe that I use is called Grandma's Dill Pickle Recipe, which you'll find on my website. And it's my recipe based on the memories that I had of my grandma's dill pickles when I was growing up. Just absolutely delicious. But pickled food doesn't stop at just dill pickles. You can make things like chutneys and relishes. This is green tomato relish, my last jar from last year. So good. But even better is probably the green tomato chutney. And this is honestly the most popular recipe on my website. This is again the last jar. I've taken it out of the fridge. Oh, that is just divine. So, so good. Cheese and crackers, just cheese board in general. You can use this as a condiment for practically anything. And when it comes to pickled foods, all it means is that whether or not the vegetables are whole or chopped like this into larger pieces, or they're minced up like this, they use an acidic environment, typically vinegar, but also salt and sugar to help preserve that food, and it adds a lot of flavor as well. And again, this is a really safe way to preserve your veg, especially if you want to preserve it in jars. Pickling fruit and vegetables is delicious, but it is a savory way to preserve. If you want to preserve food in jars easily, you're going to have to use sugar. And typically, when you use a lot of sugar to preserve, you make jams and jellies and preserves. And I do that as well. So I use the red currants from the allotment to make a red currant jelly. I use the blackberries to make blackberry jelly or jam, the strawberries again to make strawberry jam. Now, the main difference between jelly, jam, and preserves is the amount of seeds or whole fruit in it. If it doesn't have any seeds or any whole fruit, it's a jelly. If it has seeds, it's a jam. If it has chunks of fruit in it, it's a preserve. That's how I understand it. And again, this is another safe way to preserve food. And it relies on sugar, creating such a sugary environment that it is not hospitable to most yeast and bacteria and mold. Saying that, when you do make jams and jellies and sugary types of preserves, it's really important that you water bath them afterwards. And I've made syrups before in the past, which is kind of like making your jam or jelly, just a liquefied version. And I've opened up the tap to find mold growing on the top. And that's because I didn't water bath that. I made it in a very British way. And in the States, you're always taught to water bath your preserves afterwards, and it's just safer, and it will stop any heartache from an entire batch going off in the future. And it's not pressure canning. All that is creating your jams or jellies, putting it in the jars, and then boiling it in water for a certain amount of time. And then that will preserve it, kill off anything that was inside, and make it shelf safe for at least a year. We've spoken already about fermenting vegetables, but there's another type of fermenting that many more people might be aware of, and that is making alcohol. I love making homemade wines. Some of them turn out really good, some of them not so good, but over the years, I do have my favorites, including my rhubarb wine recipe. And I've just made this. I filmed the process of it, and when I decant it, I'll share the entire process of how to make rhubarb wine, but the recipe is over on my website, as is the recipe for elderflower champagne. And this is amazing. This is such a treat. It doesn't last as long as a wine, a typical country wine, but it is just refreshing, sweet, citrusy, and so good. You do have to store them in plastic bottles though because of the pressure, because it hasn't finished fermenting yet, and those yeasts are still at work, which create the fizz in it. So delicious. You'll find some pieces over on my website on how to make your own wines out of practically anything. Vegetables like parsnips, fruits like strawberries or rhubarb. But essentially what it is you're taking that vegetable or that fruit, you're making it sweeter mostly, sometimes adding a tannin, which I often use just black tea in mine. And also you do need to use yeast. Purchased yeast is much better, much more reliable than using wild yeast. And you ferment it in an airtight container. So you do have to have an airlock on the top. and then you just let it do its thing. And oftentimes you do have to age it before it's palatable. Like this rhubarb wine, it won't taste good for a full year. But the elderflower champagne, you make it and you drink it right away. So it can be very rewarding just starting with something easy and then tasting what the efforts can be like. And this is a lot less alcoholic than, say, a wine, but still really, really tasty. The other way that I preserve fruit and berries in an alcoholic beverage is to just infuse them in a hard liquor. These are black currants from this year, and I've poured over whiskey, but you can use rum, you could use brandy, it's up to you. You could use gin. And then the alcohol not only preserves the berries, but it also pulls the flavor out. And then you can either use this alcohol as is, or you can sweeten it with honey or sugar and make something that's really special. Some vegetables and even fruit can be stored on their own, whole, and oftentimes without refrigeration. And some examples include garlic, and this is one that I've taken off of this year's garlic. I've got a couple of bundles drying out in the polycrub right now, and that will last some months. And if I am worrying about my garlic going off, what I do is I will dry it out and pulse it into a powder and make garlic salt. Also, things like potatoes store really well on their own. You do have to check them to make sure that none of them start to go soggy or have blight on them. Otherwise, they'll affect all the other potatoes. Onions store really well. We've planted so many apple trees in the garden this year or over the winter. And so there'll be lots of apples in the future. Some of them will go into preserves, but some I want to store on their own. And apples can be stored whole in a cool environment. And even things like carrots, you can store carrots in sand. There are just so many ways to get around having to refrigerate whole foods and have them last through the winter. I hope that I've been able to give you some ideas as to what to do with your harvests with these 7 ways that I preserve our gluts. Although, of course, I haven't really touched upon each in detail, you can learn a little bit more about some of those preserving methods over on my website, lovelygreens.com, and I'll leave a link down in the video description. And there are also some ways to preserve food and especially herbs in my book, A Woman's Garden, Grow Beautiful Plants and Make Useful Things. Again, the link is down in the video description. Now, it isn't a vegetable, but I did want to show you this, which is honey. We have so much honey and it stores indefinitely. Literally all you need to do is to extract it from the comb, put it in jars, and it will last forever, basically. Although when I do sell honey, I do put on an expiration date of 5 years. You can just totally ignore that. No, honey can last forever. And if you want to see another interesting video, you can head over and watch my honey extraction video, which shows you exactly what's involved with harvesting honey from the comb. Thanks so much for watching, and leave me any questions or comments below. Also, if you have any unique preserving methods or recipes that you use, let us know as a comment. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time here on Lovely Greens. Bye for now.